Amen. Okay, we're looking at Matthew 24, 1 to 42. I'll quickly catch us up to where we were, and then we will carry on. All right, in Matthew 24, verse 2, Jesus, he pronounces doom on the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And in verse 3, the disciples who assume that destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, they assume it's an end-time event, something associated with the final judgment and the arrival of the eternal state. They ask him when the end will come and what will be the sign that it's about to arrive. And Jesus, in verses 4 through 8, he answers their question about the coming of the end by telling them not to be led astray during the time before the end by following any of those who come after him pretending to be the Christ, the anointed one of God. And as he makes clear in verse 27, there'll be no mistaking his coming. See, don't be misled by somebody claiming to be the Christ. There'll be no mistaking his coming. And he tells them not to be alarmed when, contrary to their expectation, the end does not come in conjunction with some particular conflict or hardship or upheaval. There will be many birth pains before the end arrives. So they are not to be alarmed. They're not to fret its failure to arrive after some specific hardship or disaster. And then in verses 9 to 14, he tells them that during that time until the end, the age of birth pains, Christians will be persecuted and killed. They will be hated throughout the world because of their allegiance to Jesus, and only those who remain faithful in the face of those trying circumstances will be saved. And only at the end of these birth pains of unspecified duration, only at the end of those birth pains of unspecified duration will the eternal state arrive. And having told them that wars and all kinds of upheaval and distress will occur without the arrival of the end, having just told them that, he then appeals to that. He uses that in verses 15 to 21. He applies that truth to correct their expectation that the destruction of Jerusalem will be accompanied by the arrival of the end. See, that was something they assumed. When he told them about the destruction of Jerusalem, they assumed that is an eschatological and end-time thing. So he now applies what he just told them to their mistaken assumption that the destruction of Jerusalem will be tied to the end. He tells them that when they see Jerusalem coming under attack, they must not misunderstand and think that it is now time for their redemption. Don't make that mistake. That event does not signal the end. The destruction of Jerusalem does not signal the end. Rather, it is a very severe episode of distress within this age of distress. It is a particularly sharp and, as it turns out, early pain within the birth pains of the Messiah. So instead of lifting their heads at that time to embrace their redemption, they must flee immediately when the Roman troops come. They have to flee immediately. Okay, that's all. We went through that last week. Now he says here, in describing the distress of Jerusalem's fall as something unequaled from the beginning of the world until now and not to be equaled again, Jesus is probably using a stock hyperbolic formula, okay? A stock way of emphasizing the severity of the suffering. In other words, it's something like our, that was the worst blank ever. That was the worst movie ever. That was the worst fight ever. That was the worst speech ever. When we say that, we're not being literal and technical and trying to say, well, is it really? Wasn't in 1842, wasn't there a speech delivered worse than that? We don't mean it that way. It is simply a way in which we emphasize how terrible it was. That was the worst blank ever. And I think this functions similarly to that. I think it's a hyperbolic formula, and you get a taste of that at a number of places in the Old Testament. For example, in Exodus 10:14, he says, the locusts came up all over the land and settled on the whole country of Egypt, such a dense swarm of locusts as had never been before, nor ever will be again. Then you look in Exodus 11:6, it says, there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as has never been, nor ever will be again. It's starting to sound like, this is a phrasing and a way of emphasizing something, a way of putting the emphasis on how bad something is. Jeremiah 37 simply says, there is none like it. And then Ezekiel 5:9, and because of all your abominations, I will do with you what I've never yet done, and the like of which I will never do again. Joel 2 has never been before, nor will ever be again. So you start to see this seems to be a kind of phrase, and especially when you look at what is said about Hezekiah, a good king of Judah, and Josiah, another good king of Judah who comes after Hezekiah. Okay, Hezekiah, it says, he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. And then we have Josiah who comes after Hezekiah, and it says, before him, there was no king like him. Hezekiah was before him. But you see, it's simply a way of saying he was really, really good. You see, and then it goes on, nor did any like him arise after him. So I think that's what's going on. I think it is a stock hyperbolic formula that would have been heard as such. Here's what Keith Matheson says in his book, From Age to Age, The Unfolding of Biblical Eschatology. He says, Jesus warns that the surrounding of Jerusalem by armies will presage a time of tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Some infer that such language can only speak of a unique end-time event. It is instructive to note, however, that such language is found in the Old Testament as well and appears to be a common hyperbole. See, something that is just in the language and in the culture, that's how we emphasize something. Moses uses similar language to describe the effects of the final plague on Egypt. Ezekiel uses such language to describe the destruction that was to befall Jerusalem in 586. Jesus appears to be using the same kind of language. He says Jesus appears to be using the same kind of language to describe the destruction that will fall upon Jerusalem in AD 70. That's what I think's going on, okay, with that part of it. But it is just possible that he's being more literal than I'm giving him credit for. In other words, it's just possible that the fall of Jerusalem was really, really bad, and maybe so bad that it's never been matched. Here's what Carson says in his commentary. He says that there have been greater numbers of deaths, 6 million in the Nazi death camps, mostly Jews, and an estimated 20 million under Stalin, but never so high a percentage of a city's population so thoroughly and painfully exterminated and enslaved as during the fall of Jerusalem. And then when you add to that all of that suffering, the anguish of divine rejection that is evident in the destruction of the city and the temple that were central to Judaism, that clear message of divine rejection there, well, maybe you can make a case that it more literally was something that had never been before and will never be again. According to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, in his book, The Jewish War, 1.1 million people died in the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans, and another 97,000 were taken prisoner by the Romans. And the people who were starving in that city as it was being besieged by the Romans, they were reduced to eating grass, cow dung, and the leather from their shoes and belts. And at least one mother murdered and ate her own baby. So you get some image of how grisly this was. And the rebels in the city, the hardcore resistance, they were torturing the people in the city who they believed had food and were holding out on them. And they inflicted horrible tortures on those people, trying to get them to reveal where they were keeping their food. So you had that going on inside, but it was no picnic outside. As Quarles says in his commentary, he said, those who were captured by the Romans fared no better. Any captured by the Romans during the siege were tortured before the city walls to terrify the city's defenders and then crucified. Josephus commented, the soldiers, out of rage and hatred, amused themselves by nailing their prisoners in different postures. And so great was their number that space could not be found for the crosses, nor crosses for the bodies. Even after a vivid description of the horrors the Jews endured, Josephus adds apologetically, to narrate their barbarities is impossible. But to put it briefly, no other city ever endured such miseries. Okay, so it certainly was an outrageous suffering. I think it's hyperbolic, but it's just possible it's more literal than I give Jesus credit for there. Now, the statement that the Great Tribulation is never to be equaled, people take that as saying, well, that then must mean that it is the end time tribulation. It is the tribulation right before the consummation. But I think it cuts the other way. You see, I think that in saying that the Great Tribulation, where it never to be equaled, I think it implies that the tribulation that is being referred to is not a tribulation at the very end of history. Any tribulation, any hardship, any suffering at the very end of history obviously cannot be equaled, right? Because there's no further history in which other tribulation can occur. There's only the consummated kingdom. So what's the point of saying it's not going to be equaled again? Well, of course it's not, because it's at the end. And there's no tribulation after that. Here's what Carson says on that point. He says that Jesus in verse 21 promises that such great distress is never to be equaled again, implies that it cannot refer to the tribulation at the end of the age. For if what happens next is the new heaven and the new earth, it seems inane to say that such great distress will not take place again. Okay, so I think it cuts the other way. But you do have people that say that. Then at 22 to 28, he says, and if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, as you can see, I think it's best to begin a new paragraph at verse 22. Now, this is a key move, okay, in the understanding that I'm presenting to you. It's a key move, but I think it's the correct move. So I'm starting a new paragraph there. Though those days, in verse 22, it's often read as referring to the attack on Jerusalem, right? So we have 4:14 where we're talking about the birth pains in the Messiah, the days of distress. Then in 15 to 21, we focus on the particular spike or birth pain of the assault on Jerusalem. Now we go to 22 and it says in those days. Now most people think, well, those days refers to the assault on Jerusalem that he was just speaking about. He's talking about those days. But I think that's not the right way to read it. I think it's better to read it as picking back up the discussion of the birth pains generally, the age of distress that is the subject of 14, up to verse 14, from 4 to 14. And seeing 15 to 21 as a discussion of a particularly difficult birth pain within the age of distress. So it goes back to that. I think that's right. Here's what Carson says. Carson, in his commentary, his assessment, he says, many problems in interpreting the Olivet Discourse relate to the assumption that those days in verse 22 refers to the period described in 15 to 21, the assault on Jerusalem. He's saying that there are a lot of problems that flow from that, tying 22 to what has just been said there. He said, and also to verse 29, but there are excellent reasons for concluding that verses 22 to 28 refer to the general period of distress introduced in verses 4 to 14, and that therefore those days refers to the entire period. In other words, the days of birth pains, the inter-Advent church age between Christ's ascension and return, to the entire period of which verses 15 to 21, the assault on Jerusalem, are only one part. You see, and so that's how I see he's talking about when's the end going to come? Well, there's going to be this whole age of distress, this age of birth pains. And then he addresses their misunderstanding that one particular spike, one particular sharp birth pain dealing with the fall of Jerusalem, that's going to be tied to the end. So he tells them about this. He then applies what he says, that there are going to be many birth pains, and you're not to tie the end to any one specific birth pain. He says, having said that, that's what you're doing in your understanding of what's going to happen with Jerusalem. So he corrects that. Then he says those days, and I think he's reconnecting to his discussion of the overall time of birth pains, the overall age of distress, and not going back specifically to what's being said in 15 to 21. Leon Morris, in his commentary, he similarly states, he says, this verse, referring to verse 22, is usually taken with the preceding. And this may be the way to understand it, but it makes a good deal of sense to take it as resuming the line of reasoning from verse 14 and applying it primarily to the end time, though of course it has an application to the fall of Jerusalem also, because the fall of Jerusalem is just one particular birth pain within this age of birth pains. Okay, but I think that's what's going on, that those days goes back and refers to the overall, the overarching age of distress. And Jesus says that this age of distress, these days of wars and famines and earthquakes and persecution and hatred and apostasy and false Christs, false prophets, he says this age of distress, those days will become so bad that if they were allowed to continue, if God in his providence did not cut it short for the sake of the elect, that no human being would survive. In other words, there's going to be an intensification of the birth pains. So we're in the age of distress, but just like in keeping with the analogy of labor, you know, these things are periodic and they're inconsistent. But as delivery comes, as the time comes, they get more intense, more frequent. Okay, so in keeping with that, you're going to have this age of distress. They're going to become so bad that if they were allowed to go on, if God in his providence didn't intervene and cut them short for the sake of the elect, that mankind would go extinct. We'd simply be eliminated. We'd be wiped off. The world would degenerate to the point of human extinction. And so God cuts those days short for the sake of the elect. Christians must be on guard against false Christs during this time of intensified birth pains. Not only will the distress, the hardship, the convulsing, not only will that be intensified, thus increasing the tendency to follow a false deliverer. You see, not only is that going to be going on, but the false Christs and the false prophets will be performing miracles as part of the way of pulling you. They'll be performing miracles. You remember in 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 to 11, the coming of the lawless one. This is Antichrist. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan with all power and lie-promoting signs and wonders. This is going to be part of it. And so here I see him referring to those things so everyone doesn't believe the truth, but delighted right will be condemned. So you see this idea. And when the Lord returns, it's going to be clear to everybody, right? So he's talking about don't be deceived, don't be getting pulled. I don't care what they show you. I don't care how they act. You see, I'm coming back, and when I come back, it's going to be a showstopper. There's going to be no mistaking it. It's not going to be like, hey, the guy's over, I heard he's over in California cooking making burgers somewhere. It's not going to be like that. That his return is going to be unmistakable. It's going to be as obvious as lightning that lights up the entire sky. It will be as impossible for mankind to miss the coming of Christ as it is for vultures to miss a carcass. I think that's what's being said. It will be as impossible for mankind to miss the coming of Christ as it is for vultures flying up with that bird's eye view to miss a carcass. Now, it's possible that line means that the false Christ proliferating at the end will be like vultures gathering over a carcass, meaning the condemned world. That's a possibility, but I prefer the angle that I just gave you. Now, it's difficult to see how the days being cut short. So you have people say, no, this is talking about Jerusalem. Well, it's really hard for me to see how the days being cut short for the sake of the elect, how that can refer to the days of Jerusalem's fall. That just doesn't make much sense to me. The days of distress associated with Jerusalem's fall, they were ended. How did those days of distress end? How were they, quote, cut short? Well, they ended by the city's destruction and the slaughter of its inhabitants. So how is bringing that conquest, cutting those days short, how is bringing that conquest sooner rather than later an act of mercy for the elect? Right? For cutting short the days of distress, for that to be an act of mercy for the elect must be suffering hardship, right? So you have, it seems to me, two requirements for cutting short the days of suffering. For that to be an act of mercy for the elect is the elect have to be suffering, and cutting the days short has to alleviate that suffering. Okay, they seem to me to be the requirements, and I don't quite see how either of those works here. The elect are Christians, right? You see that in Matthew 24:31, Romans 8, 8:33, Romans 11:7. You see it in other places. But the elect are Christians, and Christians were not suffering the hardship of Jerusalem's fall. They weren't there. They had been instructed by Jesus, when you see this happening, you get out of the city. And the church historian Eusebius, who writes in the early 4th, right from say 300 to 325, he writes a number of editions of the first history of the church. He was a theologian, very well plugged in. He says the Christians did in fact leave before the assault. Here's what Eusebius says. He says, meanwhile, before the war began, members of the Jerusalem church were ordered by an oracle given by revelation. This is Jesus telling them. You see, to those worthy of it to leave the city and settle in a city of Perea called Pella. Here they migrated from Jerusalem as if once holy men had deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea. The judgment of God might finally fall on them for the crimes against Christ and his apostles, utterly blotting out all that wicked generation. So at least according to Eusebius, the Christians heeded the Lord's words and his teaching, and they weren't there. Okay, so we're talking about is cutting short the days for the sake of the elect. Are we talking about something to do with the fall of Jerusalem? I say no, because the elect weren't suffering there because they had left. Okay, they had left. But even if Christians were suffering the hardships of the days of Jerusalem's fall, I don't see how accelerating the time of the fall, how that is sparing them from the effects of the days preceding the fall. It's simply having those days culminate in their deaths and enslavement, an outcome they were willing to suffer horribly to avoid. You see, it's not like you're sparing them the hardship or the consequence. No, you're just accelerating it. Okay, so it just doesn't fit for me. And in addition, this term here where he says, the way the ESV renders it, and that's the right sense, no human being. Right? When he sits here, it says, no human being would be saved. If these days I'm talking about were not cut short, no human being would be saved. He doesn't say no person in Jerusalem would be saved. He has a much broader focus. No human being would be saved. And so that speaks of all mankind and is broader than that, than Jerusalem. And the unqualified term elect, that most naturally refers to all Christians. And thus it suggests that those for whose sake the days were cut short were not confined to Jerusalem, because in AD 70, all Christians weren't in Jerusalem. Okay, so I just think it's not, people just look at this and think it's a no-brainer. It is not by any means. Jonathan Menn, in his book on biblical eschatology, he says of the phrase in 24:22, quote, those days will be cut short. He says of that phrase, that added comment indicates that those days include the entire period of time until the second coming, contrary to the more limited reference in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It indicates something worldwide in scope is occurring, not just a local phenomenon, because the basis on which the lives of God's people are saved is different in the two situations. In AD 70, people in Judea are urged to flee to the mountains in order to save their lives. Before Christ comes, again, people are saved not by fleeing, but by God's cutting short the days. In other words, tribulation will characterize the entire period before Christ's return, and it will even worsen shortly before his second advent, as birth pains do, but God will not allow the age to run its course, humanity to destroy itself, or his people to be eliminated from the earth. I think that's what's going on. Okay? So as I tell you always, I think about these things, I tell you how I see it and how I understand it. Are there other ways of skinning the cat? There are. But I'm telling you the one that makes the most sense to me. Now note also that the deception of false Christs and false prophets that's mentioned in verses 23 to 26, that deception occurs during those days of verse 22, and this links those days of verse 22 back to the days of distress of verses 4 to 14, right before Jerusalem in 15 to 21. It links it because he talks about those false prophets, false Christ, and it links it those days in verse 22, it links it back to verses 4 to 14 rather than to that specific distress of Jerusalem, because that same concern about being deceived by false Christ is what is expressed in 4 to 14. Okay, so I have this age of distress, talks about false Christ. I have the fall of Jerusalem. Now I'm over here. Am I talking about this age that preceded his discussion of Jerusalem? Am I going back to that? Well, it looks like he's going back to that because he's talking now again about false Christ, just as he was in 4 to 14. So all of these things say to me, that's the right way and the better way, okay? It's by no means clear. You can have people read through it and say, no, right there. He just finished talking. He said in those days, clear. No, it's not that easy. You see, it's not that easy. It's by no means clear that verse 22 relates to that distress he's just talked about in 15 to 21. The referent is ambiguous at best. Okay, it's ambiguous at best, and the interpretive problems that are solved by understanding verse 22 as picking back up with the general subject of the days of distress of verses 4 to 14, of which the fall of Jerusalem is just a part. See, the problems that are solved, they weigh in favor of that understanding. That verse 22 goes back and resumes that connection with that larger discussion about the age of distress. All right, 29 to 31. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So immediately after the birth pains of the Messiah, immediately after the days of distress that he's been talking about, there will be a divine judgment on the ungodly. This language that you see here of heavenly upheaval, right, where he says here in verse 29, where he says the sun will be darkened, the moon won't give its light, stars fall from heaven, powers of heaven to be shaken. You see, this language of heavenly upheaval, it is drawn from Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10, and 34, verse 4. And most basically, what is being said by that language? Most basically, it depicts what we might call earth-shattering events. That's what's symbolized by that. Earth-shattering events. See, those interventions of God that are so significant, so cataclysmic, that they seem to turn the world upside down. That would be how we would phrase it. You see, turn the world upside down. Well, what are you talking about? I'm talking about some tremendous intervention that has tremendous effects and change. In Isaiah 13:10, it refers to God's judgment against Babylonia, redoing the world order. You see, a cataclysmic event, earth-shattering, turns the world upside down. In Isaiah 34:4, it refers to God's judgment against all the nations, but particularly against Edom. Okay, so we have that. And then similar language is used elsewhere of God's judgment within history, on cities and nations. You have there in Ezekiel 32:7 and Joel 2:10 and Amos 8:9. All right, so you have this same kind of language is used of judgments of God within history that are earth-shattering, that have tremendous ramifications and throw everything in turmoil and chaos. But as Donald Hagner says in his commentary, there is, however, a tendency for this language of heavenly upheaval, that can be used for God's interventions and judgments within history. He says there's a tendency for this language to shade into a description of the eschatological day of the Lord. See, and this tendency becomes more apparent in the utilization of the same language in the pseudepigrapha, some intertestamental Jewish writings. You start to see this term and this kind of imagery be adopted, not now just for a judgment by God within history that has earth-shattering effects, but you start to see it to shade into the ultimate intervention by God, one that brings this reality to a close and ushers in the eternal state. In other words, this language, it became an image. This heavenly upheaval language became an image for the ultimate divine intervention. Okay, that which occurs at the end of the age and most radically alters this reality or this age by bringing it to a close and ushering in the final eternal state, the consummated kingdom of God. And it's easy to understand how that move would happen, right? Especially if, as I believe, the final judgment of God, it's a complex of events that begins with a judgment within history and culminates in the Lord's return, called the parousia, his return, the resurrection, and the irrevocable assignment of beings to their eternal abodes, heaven and hell. So it makes perfect sense to me how that usage of God's judgment within history would morph into the way of speaking about the eschatological day of the Lord. And the regular way of taking this kind of language about the coming of the Son of Man, you have people read this and say, no, this isn't talking about the second coming. And I'm going, this is the second coming. You see, yes, the regular way of taking this language that you see here about the coming of the Son of Man is as a reference to his coming again, the parousia, the second coming, the return of Christ. Carson says, compare closely 13, 40, and 41, 16, 27, 25, 31, 1 Corinthians 11, 26, 15, 52, 16, 22, and I won't read the rest of the text. He says, here are references to the Son of Man's coming, angels gathering the elect, trumpet call, clouds, glory, tribes of the earth mourning, celestial disturbances, all unambiguously related to the second advent, the second coming. You see, it seems very doubtful, to say the least, that the natural way to understand verses 29 to 35 is as a reference to the fall of Jerusalem. There are people who do that. I just think they're wrong, and they think I'm wrong, and that's how life goes. Craig Blomberg, in his commentary, says, attempts to take the coming on the clouds of the sky, attempts to take that as Christ's coming spiritually in judgment against Israel at the time of the destruction of the temple, so that all of 15 to 35 refer only to the first century events. They have to take parousia, this word coming, which almost becomes a technical term for the Lord's return. You see, for the second coming. But he says they have to take parousia in verse 27 in a way that is otherwise entirely unparalleled in the New Testament. It is much more natural, therefore, to understand Christ's coming here to earth, as in Revelation 19:11-16, when Jesus brings with him all the company of the redeemed already in heaven to join his faithful people yet on earth and still alive to meet him. All this is heralded by an angelic trumpet blast, and perhaps based, well, he says, see 1 Corinthians 15. All right, now there are many other recent commentaries on Matthew. Okay, I got a bunch of commentaries. There are many other recent commentaries on Matthew that recognize that Matthew 24:29-31 refers to the second coming of Christ. I will spare you going through them. But there are many others, and the recent commentators on the parallel passages in Mark and Luke, there are many of them that I could bore you with who also recognize this as a reference to the second coming. Okay, so that's where I think we are in the second coming. Then he says in 32-35, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, just as there are signs of a fig tree that precede the coming of summer, there are signs in that tree that precede the coming of summer. When they see all these things, meaning the birth pains, the conflict and the upheaval that will precede the Lord's coming, they can know that they are in the penultimate, the next to the last stage of redemptive history. All right, the judgment, parousia, the judgment and second coming, that complex, the judgment and parousia is the next major step in God's redemptive purpose. So when you see the birth pains, you know that you're at the door, because the next major step in the redemptive purpose is the second coming and the judgment. All right? That's what he's talking about. They will live. Now, I hope I have time to get this, because I know you're confused. You're going, what's about this generation? Okay, they will live to see these birth pains. They will live to see the general upheaval that he's been talking about, the hatred, the persecution, the earthquakes, even the destruction of Jerusalem. This generation will live to see the birth pains, but that does not mean, let me get this out, I heard that bell, that does not mean that they will see the judgment parousia. Okay, they will live to see the birth pains, all of these birth pains, but that does not mean they will live to see the judgment parousia. In other words, the birth pains, including the destruction of Jerusalem, must occur within their generation, but those birth pains need not end within their generation. You understand that? Okay, in other words, so they must occur. So this generation will see the birth pains, but that's no guarantee that the birth pains will not last longer than that generation. And that generation did see the birth pains, including the destruction of Jerusalem. But as he'll say in the next verse, the end of the birth pains no one knows except the Father. How long will the birth pains go on before they give rise to the coming of Jesus again? No one knows that except the Father. Okay? It's a lot to cram in there, and I still didn't get as far as I thought I would, but that's life. Thanks for coming.